Should you be wearing your belt all the time when you are training, or are there any benefits to beltless training when it comes to making improvements in strength? So this is a question that gets asked oftentimes where powerlifters want to know, should they be always wearing the belt when it comes to their training, when it comes to their competition list, close variations, or accessory work? Or are there times where it's beneficial to do beltless training in order to then become stronger when they put on the belt? And one of the reasons why people bring this up is they have this assumption in their mind that the belt is basically supporting them and then making those muscles underneath it weaker. So people think that belts make your core weaker, and so they have to do the beltless training in order to maintain or increase the strength of their core. But when you look at the actual research, and I can link this down in the description below to this article from Stronger by Science called the Belt Bible, and they break it down all as far as using a belt. And the section when it comes to your core or abs, you can see they've done a few different studies in this area to see what kind of effect does beltless versus belted training have on those muscles. So for the first study they looked at was the deadlift, and it was untrained people, and they found a slight increase in rectus abdominis activity, but it was non-significant. And then they found a decrease in external oblique activity when wearing a belt. Okay, so this is showing that by wearing the belt, you're actually activating the six pack or the rectus abdominis more, but activating the external obliques a little bit less. Then they did another study on football players, and they found the same findings, except that in this case, it was significant in the difference there. Okay, so in general, in these two studies, when it comes to deadlift, they found that the rectus abdominis is activated actually more by wearing a belt, and then the external obliques are activated less by wearing the belt. Then when they looked at studies for the squat, they had one study, again, in untrained people that found significantly 54% higher rectus abdominis activity. So again, when it comes to the six pack, okay, that rectus abdominis, they're seeing an increase again by wearing a belt. And then a slightly, again, non-significant 14% decrease in external oblique activation, again, when wearing the belt. So they're seeing a similar thing here where the rectus abdominis is a little bit more, external oblique is a little bit less. Then they did two studies in well-trained lifters and found no significant differences when it comes to the external obliques. So then in this study with a little bit more experienced lifters, they found that there was no decrease. All right, so if we look at all these studies, there may not be any definitive information that this is what happens when you wear a belt versus where you don't, but it seems to be that there's some signs pointing towards when you wear a belt, there's actually an increase in rectus abdominis activation and maybe a decrease in the external obliques. And then from there, it could be, insignificant based on the study, where maybe it actually doesn't have too much of an effect when it comes to external obliques or the rectus abdominis. So in my mind, when I look at these studies, and also from Greg Nuckols when he's doing this article, is that there's very unlikely that squatting and deadlifting with a belt is going to make your core weak like people think. And even if it does make your core weak, it seems to be like it's a very small amount for the external obliques, and this can still be countered by the way you're doing your training. So let's go over some different ideas. So there's different options that you have in order to try and still maintain your core strength or increase it. And with these options, you can put them all together if you want to, in whatever combination. So we can kind of break up our lifts into the main competition lifts, or squat, bench press, and deadlift, close variations like maybe a pause squat, a close grip bench press, or a pause deadlift, and then our accessory work like biceps, triceps, lunges, leg extension, those kind of things. So we can always start at the bottom and say option one, we're going to take our accessory work and make sure we're doing all that beltless. So for example, if you're going to be doing any kind of lunges or step ups or Bulgarian split squats, then you can do all that beltless so that you're working your core also during those movements. In addition, in your accessory work, you can implement core specific exercises if you want to do any kind of sit-ups, crunches, or planks in order to strengthen those muscles directly. Option two is that you can go a little bit higher and say, okay, I want to do some beltless training for my close variations. So for example, you would still do your competition squat belted, and then if you're going to do your pause squat afterwards or your pause squat on a separate day, then you can do that beltless. Same thing for deadlift. You can do your competition deadlift with a belt, and then if you're doing it that same session or a different session, you can do, for example, your Romanian deadlifts beltless to then continue to work your core and work those external obliques without the belt. And then option three, if you want to go up to the highest level and do the competition list beltless, you can then focus on certain times throughout the year where you're going to do a couple weeks of beltless training. You're not going to do the entire year beltless or an entire training cycle beltless, but maybe you say after you do a competition, you're going to spend 1 or 2 weeks doing beltless training just to train with lower loads and not have to deal with the equipment and take a break for your joints. And then you'll bring the belt back in and start lifting heavier and heavier weights. So in that case, if you're doing, 1 meet a year, maybe you do 2 weeks of beltless training. If you're doing 2 meets a year, maybe you're doing 4 weeks of beltless training. If you're doing 3 meets a year, maybe you're doing 6 weeks of beltless training. So out of the 52 weeks, you're not spending, 50%, 60%, 75% beltless training, you're spending maybe 2, 5, 10% of the year beltless training. And then, like I said, you can implement these options together. So for example, you can use the option of after every meet, you're going to do 1 or 2 weeks of beltless training. And then also all the time, your accessory work, you're going to do beltless training. That way you can make sure that you're not becoming too reliant on the belt if you feel like that's an issue. And then you're also getting some work for the core with the beltless training, as well as if you do any direct core accessory work in order to make sure that it is getting stronger or maintaining strength there. And one thing you should note that I said about beltless training when it comes to the competition list is that you don't want to spend too long without the belt. So you don't want to be spending an entire year or an entire training cycle or the majority of a training cycle doing beltless training. So this is another thing that some people think, aside from the whole making your core weaker, that if they do beltless training, then they're going to get stronger without the belt. And then when they throw the belt on, they'll be even stronger. But in reality, what I've seen from plenty of people talking about online where they experimented with this is that it doesn't happen. What happens is maybe their beltless max goes up, but their competition max with the belt doesn't actually go up. So if we take an example of a lifter, let's say they have a 405-pound squat max with the belt and knee sleeves and wrist wraps and everything like that. And let's say if they take that stuff away, they have a 315-pound max without the belt, knee sleeves, and wrist wraps. So then they go and spend 8, 12, 16 weeks doing training without their equipment, okay? And so maybe they're doing lighter weights now. They're training with 225, 255, 275. Maybe they even hit a PR and hit like a 295 or 305-pound double beltless on their squat, and it's showing indications that their beltless max has gone up. And maybe they even test it out and they see that their 315 max has now gone up to 325 or 330 pounds and they feel great about it. So then they throw the belt on and start training with the belt, or maybe even want to test out their max with their belt. And what they quickly will realize is that their belted max did not go up. And in some cases, their belted max will actually go down. So instead of it being 405 and 315, and now you build up to 315 to 325 or 330, and you think the 405 is now going to go up to 415 or 425, in reality, the 405 may come down to like 395 or 390. And so what's happening there is that during this time, this 8, 12, 16 week period of your beltless training, you've been training with lighter loads. So before with your belted max, you might be training with heavier loads and putting more of a stimulus on the major muscle for the squats. So for the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, everything like that, you're training with heavier and heavier weights, and you're using your belt in order to increase your intra-abdominal pressure and be able to maintain rigidity and be able to lift more weight. When you take that belt away, now you don't have as much intra-abdominal pressure, you don't have as much rigidity, you can't do as much weight, and you have to train with lighter loads. So now your quads, instead of getting a 5x5 with 315, 325 or something like that, now your quads are getting a 5x5 with like 225 pounds. So now those muscles are getting less of a load and less of a stimulus because the core is kind of holding you back from being able to train with heavier weights. So by having less of a stimulus, then you may maintain strength or actually decrease strength in those muscles if you train for long enough, because you're almost like detraining those leg muscles because you are trying to focus more on the core muscles. And that's why it's important to maintain your competition equipment in training for the majority of time of the year in order to continue to practice that skill, in order to get the proper stimulus on the major muscle groups, in order to continue to get stronger. So for me personally, when I program for my athletes, I often put in the notes that they should be doing things to competition standards, which means that they should be wearing all their competition equipment as far as the belt, the wrist wraps, the knee sleeves, and then doing things to standards, whether it is squatting to depth or, pausing their bench press on their chest or coming to a complete stop and resetting all their deadlifts. That way they are practicing their skill as much as possible, and they're using the max amount of load as far as being in relation to their competition lift, rather than doing beltless training or no knee sleeve training, that kind of stuff, where you're going to be training with lower loads and creating less of a stimulus for those muscles. So no, training with the belt does not make your core weaker. If anything, it's actually activating the rectus abdominis more, and that you should should be training with your belt and the rest of your competition equipment as much as you can throughout the year. If you want to do any beltless training, you can maybe do certain weeks of the year where you do beltless training on the competition lifts, or you can do your close variations as beltless training, or you can do your accessory work as beltless training and do direct core work in order to make sure those muscles don't get weak if you are worried about that. But don't focus too much on your core and not wanting your core to get weaker and then make all those other muscles weaker because of it.